Hello class, so I'm starting out by answering our questions having to do with Hume's position on morality and taking it to maybe some problematic points in how it is that students were understanding Hume's morality. So actually I'm taking you here, first of all, to the same book. So this is the same book that we looked at, A Treatise of Human Nature. But yet it's not a part that we read, and it's not a part that we read, but it is the core of what we want to focus on as far as reason's place in morality. Okay, so here I highlighted probably the most important sentence we want to focus on. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. So here we have Hume showing us that the source of morality is not reason. So you're always just thinking of it that way. He's not necessarily saying anything like it's unreasonable to delegate morality in the way that we do by way of reason, that reason is not mediating, anything like that. What he's really pointing out and that we need to really get a hold of is that reason is not the source, it is subservient to the passions. Okay, so notice he writes, they serve and obey, to serve and obey them. That, in other words, the passions follow behind our emotion. Okay, excuse me, the reason follows behind emotion. Okay, so and the passions in terms of morality as its source. Okay, so we're always just thinking of it as its source. So let's go to the reading that we looked at here. So just a key to think about, what is Hume's position on morality was our first question. How is morality connected to reason for Hume? What is the role of the passions and emotions for Hume? So that one was, I think that most students got this really good because remember that Hume is pointing out that moral distinctions are not derived from reason, as we see here. So let's keep scrolling down. Here we have him pointing this out, that morality is based in the passions as its source. Okay, so what he's going through all these pains to show us that the passions are what take us to action, not the reason itself. Okay, and it's always in that order for Hume because he's an empiricist, so he needs there to be perception and emotion as the source of reason. Excuse me, as the source of morality. Okay, so then we have, for it proves directly that actions do not derive from merit or conformity to reason, nor their blame from a contrariety to it, and it proves the same truth more indirectly by showing us that as reason can never immediately prevent or produce any action by contradicting or approving it, it cannot be the source of moral good and evil which are found to have influence. Now notice this. We're showing that reason is a way in which we contradict and approve something, right? So in other words, if we didn't have reason, we wouldn't be able to contradict and approve things. So in other words, he's not suggesting that we don't contradict and approve things. He's showing that the source of morality is having to do with the passions, and that reason follows behind that. In other words, we contradict and approve afterward. Okay, so here we go. Here, scroll down. looking at? Okay, so here again, as operations of human understanding divide themselves into two kinds, the comparing of ideas and the inferring of matters of fact. Were virtue discovered by understanding, it must be the object of one of these operations, nor is there any third operation of understanding which can discover it. So, in other words, we have these ways of thinking, right? Matters of fact, then comparing of ideas. Comparing of ideas and matters of fact are ways that we think. They are not the source, though, of morality. So that's his point, is that reason isn't exactly the source. The other thing I wanted to point out too, let's see if it's up here. I think I just passed it. Yes, this point on perception. That, in other words, remember that it's not just emotion that we're thinking about. So I noticed students were writing about this idea that it's just emotion that we're thinking of, that morality is just based on emotion. Remember that it's emotion and perception, okay? Because remember, Hume is a empiricist, so that means that he needs to base all of the knowledge of our world and the way in which we understand our morality on perception and emotion. Okay. So here too, the oak tree example, this really is to show us the importance of his is-ought problem. In other words, we cannot derive morality from what is. We cannot derive ought from is. In other words, we can't go find morality in nature. So that oak tree example is really an example of how we can't go find. So even though he's implying what we want to focus on there, that in other words, with the oak tree example, nature is implied as a place or an external source whereby morality cannot be found. Okay. We bring it, and we are passionate creatures. And also, let's make these other points about nature. Okay, so, but in the second place, should it be asked whether we ought to search for these principles in nature or whether we must look for them in some other origin? So know that the reason I'm focusing on this nature part is this is really the part where I noticed students were having a little more difficulty. So again, in this example, here he's showing that we cannot find it within this oak tree example. Okay, can't just go look at the sapling and its activities, go to the causes, and figure out that the sapling was committing parricide or somehow immoral. He's saying that the will itself is where we're basing the act of parricide. So there's something we hadn't really touched on, is this idea of will, but it's not just so nature is implied there. Okay, and that's more or less the is-ought problem. Okay, so then here again we go to some of his, albeit interesting, still very difficult writing on nature here. So, but in the second place, it should be asked whether we ought to search for these principles in nature or whether we must look for them in some other origin. So here I'm asking, I had asked you, what is nature for Hume? And we're looking at this in a way where understand that with Hume, we are in this context where, first of all, this is a treatise on human nature. So he points out that But in the second place, should it be asked whether we ought to search for these principles in nature or whether we must look for them in some other origin? I would reply that our answer to this question depends on the definition of the word nature. Okay. If nature is opposed to miracles, not only the distinction betwixt vice and virtue is natural, but also every event which ever happened in the world, excepting those miracles on which religion is founded, etc. And saying these sentiments of virtue and vice are natural in this case, we make no very extraordinary discovery. In other words, he's kind of pointing out that, well, it seems that it's natural that we have virtue and vice, right? So it's natural that we have the passions. Okay. Then by nature, we may also be opposed to rare and unusual. So that's the artificial sense. So in other words, this way in which we are thinking about morality is having to do with this idea that sometimes outstanding virtue is uncommon or unnatural. And so he's then proposing that, well, natural doesn't quite fit into an exact definition here. We say that natural is, we have our morality naturally, but yet is acting virtuously natural? Well, in some cases it's not. It kind of goes back to the discussion I was having with normal. So when we think something is normal, acting virtuously or excellently may not be normal. So it's a little bit of his point here. So is it natural or unnatural? Where are those natural and unnatural ways of thinking about this? So then we may only affirm at this head that if ever there was anything which could be called natural in this sense, the sentiments of morality certainly may. In other words, our sentiments are natural to us. Since there never was any nation in the world, nor any single person in any nation who was utterly deprived of them, and who never in any instance shewed the less approbation or dislike of manners, showed the least approbation. Okay, so in other words, he's pointing out sentiments are natural. So then we go all the way down. He's trying to figure out how to angle this. And what we're really looking at is he then determines this. 'Tis impossible, therefore, that the character of natural and unnatural can ever in any sense mark the boundaries of vice and virtue. So in other words, musing on whether sentiments are natural or unnatural, it's too difficult because nature itself is not where we find vice and virtue. Okay, so yes, it's within our sentiments, but at the same time, our sentiments cannot be found in the oak tree example. We can't just go root around in nature and find morality there. We find it in ourselves, but that's it. Okay, we only find it in experience, and even that experience can be termed natural and unnatural, depending on how we look at it. So therefore, natural cannot be, or nature cannot be, the way in which we define morality. Okay, and so that's probably the most difficult question that we had. Maybe what it was that students were losing steam on toward the end, and by the way, this was at the very end of the document, so I could see how maybe that's why we were having the problems. Okay, so we'll take it from there and talk to you later.